All right, welcome back everyone to two more in this series of 12 videos about basic ethical theories. These two are about the ethics of care. Now, the ethics of care makes relationships of caring the core of human moral commitment. Whereas deontology had put duties of reciprocal respect at the center, and utilitarianism had put prevention of harms and promotion of pleasures at the center, the ethics of care says that it can, in a sense, supplant these other two universalistic ethics with one that's more focused on the particular attachments that form the real stuff of human moral commitments. But let's name and avoid a common mistake here right off the bat. The ethics of care isn't saying in response to deontology, prioritize the good of those you now do care about over the abstract duties you might have to others. One could say that. One could say, yeah, go ahead and lie to Kant's murderer at the door because your friendship trumps any supposed duty not to lie. But that's not the ethics of care per se. And the ethics of care isn't saying in response to utilitarianism, go ahead and care about your own particular children, prioritize them over strangers drowning in ponds or starving continents away. One could say that. One could say that if they were arguing for a more particularistic way of assigning the responsibility to do as much good as we can. But again, that's not the ethics of care per se. The ethics of care isn't saying to prefer your current moral attachments, because it's entirely possible that the ethics of care might generate a duty not to lie, and it might see a moral loss in lying to that murderer, even if you still do it. And it's entirely possible it would see a moral loss also in not caring for those children starving abroad, even if you still prioritize your own. We are in, or could be in, caring relationships with these people too, maybe even the murderer. We don't just serve our present caring relationships, heedless of all others. So there's a bit of a paradox here. The ethics of care does put actual caring relationships as the core human moral commitment, and it does argue against the abstract or universalistic tendencies of deontological and utilitarian ethics, but it's not merely a particularistic ethic telling you to care about your family and community and clan at the expense of others. It's better to say that the ethics of care uses our actual caring relationships as the ideal for what our moral relationship to others can and should be. The ideal of caring should be extended, these ethicists are saying, to integrate the various webs of relationships that we do have with those that we should also care about, even if we don't yet extend our care to them. So the ethics of care seems to a lot of people like an attractive alternative to the more dry, rationalistic approaches of some of the other ethics that we've studied. Deontology and utilitarianism seem to suggest we have to do right to others without any emotional attachment to them. Kant had even said that if we did the right thing because of emotional attachments, we didn't act from pure goodwill, so the action couldn't be truly right. Singer, on the other hand, did argue that we should be benevolent, yes, but also he argued, using Sidgwick's language, that we should be disinterested between all others. The ethics of care, by contrast, emphasizes the role of the moral emotions in caring. So you'll see these authors invoke sympathy, empathy, and response to vulnerability, all of which seem to some of us to provide some sort of better explanation for our moral behavior, and also to be normatively good as well. But of course, as we have with every theory we've studied, we'll see objections to the ethics of care as well. In our second video, we'll see that some people are worried that empathy is also at the basis of human tribalism. In other words, that the connection to cared-for intimates comes along with the exclusion of disdained others. And we'll also see that some argue that the ethics of care gives you a false sense of how close to a universalistic ethic it could really get. They say it's forever going to remain mired in particular attachments. And we'll also see that still others say that the care ethicists were trying to value ways of moral being that they associated with feminine, but that they only managed to essentialize a gender stereotype in doing that. Okay, but before we see these objections, let's see what the ethics of care puts down as the core commitments of human moral life. We'll look in this video at how Carol Gilligan, one of the leading lights in the ethics of care, makes her argument, and she does it, we'll see, through a close reading of the moral reasoning of an 11-year-old girl named Amy. The chapter from Gilligan's In a Different Voice that you'll find on Canvas has this story in it, and it has also the story of another 20-something woman named Claire, who I'll mention later. Both examples, as I've already said, involve really closely considering the actual words that Amy and Claire use to talk about their interior moral lives, rather than thinking of them, as other ethicists might, as being sort of half-hearted deontologists or faltering utilitarians. Gilligan listened to their words, and she understood them as embodying an entirely different ethic. They speak in a different voice, not a lesser one. So, Gilligan was a moral psychologist working at Harvard with the famous Lawrence Kohlberg in the 1970s. What they would do is they would ask children of all ages and adults to talk about moral scenarios, and then they would rate their spoken responses for their sophistication or their maturity or their level of development, they sometimes said. Now, the most famous of these scenarios was called the Heinz dilemma. I'm going to change it just a touch here to make it seem more 2020s than 1970s, but this is very close to the scenario the children were asked to respond to. In a city in Germany, a woman was near death from a very bad disease. There was one drug that the doctors thought might save her, a new drug that a biotech scientist in the same city had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to manufacture, but the scientist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him. He paid $2,000 to make it and charged $20,000 for a dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everybody he knew to borrow the money, but he could get together only about $10,000, half of what it cost. He told the scientist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later, but the scientist said, "No, I discovered the drug, I own the intellectual property, and I'm going to make money from it." Heinz got desperate and broke into the biotech company's labs to steal the drug for his wife. So that's the scenario. Ask yourself, was Heinz right to do what he did? What should he have done? And here are the responses from Carol Gilligan's study subjects, Jake and Amy. These are covered in detail in the Gilligan chapter from In a Different Voice that you have on Canvas. So Jake, who's 11, says basically this: Heinz should steal the drug. For one thing, a human life is worth more than money, and if the scientist only makes $8,000, he's still going to live. But if Heinz doesn't steal the drug, his wife is going to die. Now, what made Kohlberg categorize Jake's answer as more advanced is discussed on page 26 of Gilligan. It's not that he came to the right moral answer. He says, steal the drug, and from some perspectives, that might be wrong. It's instead that he speaks in abstract principles. He compares the value of life to that of money and finds life more important. So let's say he sounds utilitarian in that. But he could have said Heinz had a duty not to steal, sounding more deontological, and Kohlberg would have classified him still as equally advanced. What's important is that Jake speaks in abstract principles. How do we know they're abstract? Well, he literally abstracts away from any particulars of the situation. As Gilligan reports, Jake said that Heinz should steal the drug even if he doesn't love his wife because it was simply the right thing to do in principle, regardless of the particular motives that he had. And Jake said that maybe a judge would send Heinz to jail for this, although Jake himself, for some reason, didn't think that that was likely to happen. But he said if the judge did this, or if the law insisted on jailing Heinz, then Jake said that the judge or the law were morally wrong. Or, in other words, there exists for Jake a higher set of principles above the law which can be used to judge even the law itself. But then Kohlberg classified Amy, also 11, as much less advanced. Amy said exactly this: "I don't think Hines should steal the drug. If he stole the drug, he might save his wife then, but if he did, he might have to go to jail, and then his wife might get sicker again, and he couldn't get more of the drug, and it might not be good. So they should really just talk it out and find some other way." Gilligan took that response as definitive of the ethics of care in some sense. Amy puts relationships at the core of her response. Hines has an ongoing commitment to his wife, not just a need to act in this one situation. And the scientist can be sort of brought into the community of caring commitment as well. Amy is certain that if Hines finds a way to talk it out with him, the scientist too will see that he should care about Hines's wife, and really he should care about all people with this disease. That is who the drug is for in some sense, so the scientist inventing it put him in a caring relationship to them. So note that the ethics of care doesn't necessarily say, steal the drug because you care. As I emphasized right off the bat, it doesn't necessarily tell you to put particular relationships above all else and then do anything, however much it defies duty or law or community norms, in order to show caring to those who you are connected to now. No, the ethics of care is about something larger. Its model, its ideal, is the caring we show for the particular loved ones to whom we have commitments. Yes, that's true. But then it asks us to expand our caring commitment to really anyone who needs our care, anyone who is vulnerable. Their need, their vulnerability, becomes their claim upon our moral capacity for caring. It's not their rationality to which we owe a duty, or their ability to feel pain to which we owe as much as we do to our own pains and pleasures. Their vulnerability and our caring. And because of those things, we owe it to them to extend our caring relationship across an entire community, across an entire social fabric, trying to live up to caring commitments across all of our groupings. That's what Gilligan calls on page 28 Amy's narrative of relationships that extends over time. Amy wants Hines to sustain the relationship with his wife and the scientist over time, not to sever either. She does judge the scientist for not giving the drug, but she's pretty sure that he too can be convinced to do so, and he can be convinced to see that he has a care responsibility to give aid to the vulnerable. So everyone in the dilemma should make a commitment to care for anyone who needs care. And it's a moral commitment, not merely a felt attachment of the emotions, because Amy says that even if Hines didn't love his wife, or even if the sick person were a stranger, Hines should do the same thing. He should work to convince the scientist to see his responsibilities and provide sustained care for the sick. Kohlberg would say that Amy's thinking is just muddled. Gilligan talks about that on page 30. He thought that Amy was merely thinking of the emotional selves of Hines and his wife. How could they keep their relationship going? He thought that Amy was unable to get beyond the characters' emotions and to some sort of larger rules for them to follow. And to the extent that Amy did see any rules or roles that people should follow, Kohlberg said, she was merely talking about conformity to expected social norms. She said that Hines should do this because he's a husband. The scientist should do that because his role is to heal people, and so on. That's what Kohlberg thought. But when you think about Amy's answer, in a lot of ways it's more sophisticated than Jake's. She's thinking about an entire social solution in which everyone would be convinced of the part that they needed to play for others. And because of that, the system would persist through social space and through time. Now, some might respond, oh, but Amy's naive. She's never going to get everyone in her society to do their caring part. But really, that's precisely what we do with the sick in our society. There's a really complicated system that sometimes includes lower negotiated prices for necessary drugs, social insurance for people who cannot afford those drugs, and drug companies actually sometimes give away their product for low or no price to the needy and to the vulnerable. And when somebody violates that system, we might actually put them in jail. Martin Shkreli was called the pharma bro. He jacked up the price of life-saving drugs by 5,000%, and he found himself in jail and paying a huge fine, and many Americans approved of that. So maybe it's Jake who's naive. His vision of the dilemma is static. There are only a few people involved, and it's Heinz's calculations that matter the most. Everyone else simply has to give way to the logic of Heinz's actions. Amy's answer is more dynamic. Heinz has to think about time, for one thing. He could steal the drug now, but then have to go to prison. And while he's there, his wife could fall ill again, and he wouldn't be around to help her if that happens. So to Amy, Heinz's acts are part of a longer-term caring relationship. And for another thing, Heinz has to think about how others will act and react across a very complicated social space. Amy doesn't think that Heinz should let his wife die, but she does think that he should find a way to carry out his care relationship consistent with keeping the peace with all the others around him. The key here is the harmony that's supposed to be established among all relevant participants. A care ethic isn't going to assert Heinz has a duty of care to his wife above all others, so he can assert that duty above all others. That's sort of the masculine way of seeing it, Jake's way of seeing it. That's about self-assertion, doing what the agent thinks is right, regardless of the broader social context. No, from the perspective of the care ethic, classical ethical theories all have that sort of male, self-assertive quality to them. Under the guise of abstract universalism, they tell you to ignore the particular connections that you have to loved ones, your community, even your nation, and they tell you to do what you know to be right, using your own abstract rationality, even at the expense of these other connections. In a weird sense, under the guise of equal concern for all, universally, these classical theories are urging you to be uncaring towards those who are close to you. But the ethics of care seeks to preserve the overall social fabric of caring in which the particular care relationship is established. And it seeks to repair any breaches of the overall fabric, both near and at some distance. Stephen West in the Philosophize This podcast on Canvas is pretty insightful on this point. The ethics of care is thought by its proponents to be feminine in this sense. Because of how women and girls are socialized, they come to think that their job is to keep the peace, to be socially adept at maintaining those relationships over time and across social space. They're told that their job is to put their own needs to the side and to care for children, the sick, the disabled, and the elderly. And they're told that they do this within the delicate fabric of an entire community, so they should tread very carefully. Men and boys are told, on the other hand, to be problem solvers. They are to assert their vision of right, not necessarily to maintain relationships. But that then leads to the first critique that we're going to take up in our next video. The critique there is that in trying to praise the different voice of Amy, the ethics of care merely essentializes a gender difference. It takes an injustice in how women's roles are structurally defined for them and turns it into an essential or almost naturalistic ethic.